Rome was the greatest city the ancient world had ever known. Its name was synonymous with civilization itself. For centuries, it stood at the center of an empire that stretched from the foggy shores of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the rivers of Mesopotamia. No city in human history had ever commanded such power, such wealth, or such enduring prestige. And yet, in the year 330 AD, the ruler of that empire turned his back on Rome. He built a new capital on the other side of the known world and declared it the center of Roman civilization. The question that historians have wrestled with ever since is deceptively simple. Why would the Romans replace Rome? The answer reaches into the deepest crises of the ancient world, into the survival instincts of an empire under siege, and into the strategic genius of one of history's most consequential rulers. Constantine the Great did not simply build a city. He made a decision that would shape the fate of empires, religions, and civilizations for more than 1,000 years. To understand why Rome had to be replaced, you first have to understand what the Roman Empire had become by the 3rd century AD. At its height, the empire covered roughly 5 million square kilometers. Its population numbered in the tens of millions. Its legions garrisoned frontiers separated by thousands of miles of road, river, and sea. Governing this empire from a single city had always required enormous coordination. But as the centuries passed, a fundamental problem became impossible to ignore. Rome was in the wrong place. The city of Rome sits at the center of the Italian peninsula, deep in the western Mediterranean. In the early centuries of the empire, that position made a certain kind of sense. The western provinces were wealthy, densely populated, and central to Roman power. But by the 3rd century, the empire's most dangerous frontiers were not in the west. They were in the east and along the Danube. The Persian Empire to the east had revived under a new dynasty, the Sassanids, who were aggressive, organized, and determined to reclaim territories they considered their ancient birthright. Along the Danube, Germanic tribes applied relentless pressure against the northern border. These threats required rapid military response. Marching armies from Rome to the Danube or to the Euphrates was not simply inconvenient. It was strategically catastrophic. At the same time, the economic balance of the empire was shifting. The eastern provinces, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor, had always been the wealthiest, the most urbanized, and the most productive regions under Roman control. Alexandria was a city of staggering commerce. Antioch controlled the silk routes connecting Rome to China and India. The east generated tax revenue, grain, and trade wealth that the western provinces could not match. An emperor sitting in Rome was governing from the periphery of his own empire's economic heart. The structural weaknesses of ruling such a vast empire from such a distant location became catastrophically apparent during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire came closer to complete collapse than at any point in its history. In the space of 50 years, more than 50 men claimed the title of emperor. Most of them died violently. Civil war became the normal condition of the state. Rival generals fought one another while foreign enemies poured through the frontiers. The Sassanid Persians captured the Emperor Valerian in battle in 260 AD, an unprecedented humiliation. The Goths raided deep into the Balkans and even reached the coasts of Greece. The empire fragmented temporarily into 3 competing states: a Gallic empire in the west, a Palmyrene empire in the east, and a rump Roman state in the middle struggling to hold everything together. The economy collapsed under the strain. Currency was debased. Trade networks broke down. Cities that had thrived for centuries shrank behind newly built walls. What the crisis of the 3rd century demonstrated beyond all doubt was that one man governing from Rome could not respond quickly enough to threats that emerged simultaneously at opposite ends of the empire. Emperors who remained in Rome were cut off from their armies. Emperors who went to fight in person found their backs exposed to rivals who seized the throne in their absence. The entire system required reinvention. Some emperors began the process of adapting. Diocletian, who stabilized the empire after the worst of the crisis, created the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 rulers sharing imperial authority across different regions. He himself rarely visited Rome. He ruled from Nicomedia in Asia Minor, far closer to the eastern frontiers that mattered most. The message was clear: effective Roman government no longer lived in Rome. Into this transformed empire came Constantine. His rise to power was itself a product of the instability the crisis had created. He emerged from the western portion of the empire, where his father Constantius had served as one of Diocletian's co-emperors. When Constantius died in 306 AD, Constantine's troops proclaimed him emperor on the spot, a classic example of the military-driven succession politics that had defined the crisis era. But Constantine was no ordinary soldier emperor. He had strategic vision and political intelligence in equal measure. His path to sole rulership was long and violent. The Tetrarchy fractured almost immediately after Diocletian's retirement. Competing claimants plunged the empire into another round of civil wars. Constantine fought his way through them. In 312 AD, at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, he defeated Maxentius and secured control of the Western Empire. He reportedly attributed his victory to the Christian God, a claim that would carry enormous consequences for the future of both the empire and the religion. By 324 AD, after defeating his last rival Licinius, Constantine stood as sole master of the entire Roman world, East and West unified under a single ruler for the first time in decades. But unity had not solved the underlying problems. The empire was still enormous. The eastern frontiers still demanded constant attention. The Sassanids still pressed from the east. The Germanic tribes still pushed from the north. Constantine understood that consolidating his victory required more than military force. It required restructuring how the empire was governed and from where. He needed a capital that put him at the center of everything that mattered. The city he chose was Byzantium, an ancient Greek settlement perched on a narrow peninsula where Europe and Asia nearly touch each other across a narrow channel of water. It had existed for nearly 1,000 years before Constantine arrived, but its true potential had never been fully realized. Constantine saw what others had overlooked. In terms of strategic geography, Byzantium was close to perfect. The location sits astride the Bosporus Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and from there to the Aegean and the Mediterranean beyond. This strait is not merely a body of water. It is the hinge point of the ancient world's geography. Every ship moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass through it. Every land route connecting Europe to Asia had to cross near it. Whoever controlled Byzantium controlled the flow of people, armies, trade, and grain across an entire hemisphere. No other location on the map offered that combination. The trade implications alone were extraordinary. The Black Sea's northern shores produced grain that fed millions across the Mediterranean world. The eastern trade routes carrying silk, spices, and luxury goods from China, India, and Persia converged on the region. The rivers of the Danube basin connected the Balkans to Central Europe through the Black Sea. A capital at Byzantium would sit at the intersection of all of these systems, drawing revenue from trade that passed through its waters, whether its rulers willed it or not. Constantinople would become over time one of the wealthiest cities in human history, not because of conquest, but because of geography. Militarily, the advantages were equally compelling. The Danube frontier, the perpetual source of Germanic pressure from the north, lay within relatively rapid striking distance. When Gothic raiders or Hunnic cavalry threatened the Balkans, an emperor based at Constantinople could respond in weeks rather than months. The Persian frontier to the east was similarly within reach. The old calculation that had made Rome central, that the West mattered most, had been permanently reversed. The wars that would determine the empire's fate were fought in the east and along the Danube. A ruler at Constantinople was close to both. The natural defenses of the site were remarkable even by ancient standards. Byzantium occupied a triangular peninsula bounded by water on two of its three sides. To the north lay the Golden Horn, a deep natural harbor of extraordinary length that could shelter an entire fleet while remaining nearly impossible to assault from the sea. To the south lay the Sea of Marmara, wide and unfordable. Only the western land approach required conventional fortification. An attacker could not simply march up to the walls from all directions. They would have to conduct an amphibious assault across contested water, a feat beyond most ancient armies. Constantinople's geography made siege warfare against it extraordinarily difficult, a fact that would be tested and validated time and again across more than 1,000 years. This combination, commercial dominance, strategic positioning, and natural defensibility, was not accidental. Constantine recognized in Byzantium a site that could function as the command center for a vast empire in ways that Rome simply could not. The decision was rational before it was symbolic. Construction began in earnest around 324 AD, and in 330 AD, Constantine officially dedicated the new capital, which he named Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The scale of the building program was extraordinary. Constantine did not merely upgrade an existing city. He created a new Rome from the ground up, consciously modeling it on the city he was in practical terms replacing. The city was designed with the same structural logic as Rome. It had a forum, as Rome had its forums. It had a hippodrome for chariot racing, modeled on the Circus Maximus, capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators. It had grand colonnaded streets, public baths, administrative palaces, granaries, cisterns, and harbors. Statues and monuments were transferred or copied from Rome and the wider empire to fill the new capital with the weight of Roman tradition. The Great Serpent Column from Delphi, commemorating the Greek victory over Persia, was brought to the hippodrome. Ancient treasures that had stood for centuries were relocated to demonstrate that Constantinople had inherited the prestige of the ancient world. Constantine gave the city a senate. He gave it grain distributions for the populace, the free bread that had for centuries been the gift of Roman rulers to Roman citizens. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome. The intent was unmistakable. This was not a regional administrative center. This was the new heart of the empire, endowed with all the institutions, symbols, and legitimacy that the Roman world recognized as markers of supreme power. Gradually, inevitably, Constantinople surpassed the city it was modeled on. The East was wealthier. The trade routes were richer. The threats were more immediate. Where emperors went, power followed. Where power went, wealth followed. Constantinople grew larger, wealthier, and more magnificent with each generation, while Rome, still revered, still celebrated, became increasingly a monument to a past that no longer drove the empire's present. There was a second dimension to Constantine's decision that cannot be separated from the strategic one. Constantine was Christianity's first imperial patron. His support for the religion after the Milvian Bridge, whether rooted in genuine faith or political calculation, historians continue to debate, transformed it from a persecuted minority into the favored faith of the imperial court. The old city of Rome was deeply entangled with the traditional religious fabric of paganism. Its temples, its priesthoods, its civic rituals were woven through every aspect of public life. A new capital had no such entanglements. Constantinople was built as a Christian city from its foundations. Its churches, its dedications, its symbols reflected the new religious identity that Constantine was promoting across the empire. The city became the seat of the Christian Roman emperor, a title that carried implications not just for political authority, but for the direction of Christian doctrine itself. Great church councils were convened nearby. The city's religious identity fused with its imperial identity in ways that would define Byzantine civilization for centuries. When later emperors built the Hagia Sophia, one of the most magnificent buildings ever constructed, they were expressing something fundamental about what Constantinople had become, not merely the capital of an empire, but the capital of a Christian civilization. History validated Constantine's judgment with a clarity that is almost startling. The century after his death saw Constantinople grow into the most powerful city in the Western world. Its trade revenues funded armies and walls. Its strategic position allowed emperors to shift forces between the Danube and the Persian frontiers with flexibility that Rome had never permitted. The Theodosian walls, constructed in the early 5th century, transformed the city into a fortress of almost unassailable strength, a double line of fortifications stretching across the land approach, backed by a moat, capable of absorbing attacks that would have destroyed any other city. Those walls were tested early and often. Hunnic armies swept across the Balkans and threatened the city. Barbarian federates challenged imperial authority from within. Germanic kingdoms carved up the western provinces, and in 476 AD, the final emperor of the Western Roman Empire was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. Rome fell. The western half of Constantine's empire dissolved into successor kingdoms that would take centuries to stabilize. The Roman name survived in the Germanic courts of Charlemagne and others, but Roman governance, Roman law, Roman administration, the living Roman state survived only in the East, only in Constantinople. Constantine had built his capital in the right place. The Western Empire, which he had ruled from a geographic disadvantage, could not sustain itself against the pressures of the 5th century. The Eastern Empire, anchored to Constantinople's wealth and defended by its walls, endured. The strategic logic that had driven Constantine's decision proved, across centuries of crisis, to have been correct. What followed was one of history's most remarkable stories of endurance. The civilization centered on Constantinople, called the Byzantine Empire by later historians, though its people always called themselves Romans, survived for more than 11 centuries after Constantine dedicated the city in 330 AD. It outlasted the Western Empire by nearly 1,000 years. It fought off the Sassanid Persians in a series of devastating wars that brought the empire to the edge of extinction in the early 7th century. It held against Arab armies that swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered Egypt, Syria, and North Africa in the span of a single generation. It repelled Viking attacks from the north. It absorbed and redirected Crusader armies that arrived from the west with complicated intentions. It preserved Roman law, Roman administrative traditions, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology through centuries when much of the rest of the Mediterranean world descended into chaos. Every time attackers came before the walls of Constantinople, they discovered what Constantine had understood: the city was not easy to kill. The Golden Horn made naval assault treacherous. The Sea of Marmara protected the southern approach. The Theodosian walls held against everything from battering rams to early gunpowder weapons. Arab armies besieged the city twice in the 7th and 8th centuries and failed both times. The wall stood. Constantinople became the custodian of a civilization. In its libraries, scholars preserved ancient texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. Texts that, when they eventually filtered back into Western Europe during the Renaissance, would help ignite an intellectual transformation that remade the modern world. In its workshops, craftsmen maintained traditions of art and architecture whose influence spread across the Orthodox Christian world, from Russia to Ethiopia. In its courts, Roman law continued to develop and function as a living system of governance, forming the basis of legal traditions that persist in modified form across much of the world today. The end, when it finally came, arrived on May 29, 1453. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II had surrounded the city with the largest army and the most powerful artillery the region had ever seen. The population of Constantinople had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 people. The empire it governed had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. After weeks of siege and bombardment, the walls that had held for over 1,000 years were finally breached. The last Roman emperor, Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, died fighting in the streets. A civilization that had traced its lineage directly back to Augustus Caesar. 12 centuries of unbroken Roman imperial succession came to an end. Return then to the original question. Why did the Roman Empire abandon Rome and choose Constantinople as its capital? The answer is written across 12 centuries of history. Constantinople became the capital because it offered what Rome no longer could. It was better positioned at the crossing of continents. It was better defended by sea and by the walls that made it nearly impregnable. It was closer to the Persian frontier and the Danube border where the empire's most dangerous enemies gathered. It sat at the intersection of the ancient world's most lucrative trade routes. It was suited in a way that Rome had ceased to be to the actual task of governing and defending an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Constantine did not simply choose a city. He diagnosed the structural crisis of the Roman world and answered it with an act of geographic imagination. Rome had created the empire. Its legions, its laws, its roads, its language, its culture had bound the Mediterranean world into a single civilization. But Rome itself, the seven-hilled city by the Tiber, could no longer sustain what it had built. Constantinople could, and it did, for 1,000 years after Rome had ceased to be more than a memory. The decision made in 330 AD echoes forward through all of subsequent history. The Orthodox Christian world that stretches from Greece to Russia to the Middle East traces its spiritual and cultural heritage to the civilization Constantine planted on the Bosporus. The legal traditions of continental Europe descend in part from the Roman law preserved and refined in Constantinople's courts. The Islamic empires that followed in its wake, including the Ottoman Empire that finally ended it, defined themselves in direct relationship to the city they had conquered. Even the word used for the Roman emperor in Slavic languages, Tsar, is a direct descent from the Caesar whose decision launched all of this. When Constantine turned east and chose the shores of the Bosporus, he did not know that he was making one of the most consequential decisions in human history. He knew only that the empire needed a new center. He was right. And the world he made in that moment did not fully end until a Tuesday morning in May, 1453, when the last Roman cannon fire faded over the walls of Constantinople and an empire older than Christianity itself passed into history.